Hi all, good evening. My name is Monica. I'm from Sane Energy Project. Thanks so much for joining us tonight and taking a break from going out in the streets for our confab on climate, capitalism, and solutions. We have a really incredible group of speakers tonight, and we're going to have time for questions at the end, so we'll just dive right in. So we're in this really unique moment right now, right, where thousands of people are taking to the streets every day for justice for Black lives. A lot of people who may not have been able to do that if it weren't for this pandemic right now. So we have this chance with these militant mass mobilizations to build a more equitable world that we really want to see. We already know that the industry is using this as an opportunity for disaster capitalism, so we want to be very clear and intentional with this power and what steps we take for a just transition, that we move away from fossil fuels, away from the police state, towards affordable, sustainable, renewable energy, and to truly invest in communities. And we need every day to center our fight against structural violence and racism within our environmental and climate movements. As we were chanting on the streets at the pipeline just a couple days ago, that racial justice is climate justice, because Black and brown communities have always been the ones to be most deeply impacted by the fossil fuel industry. We know this, and we have to recognize it and call out environmental racism and dismantle it, just as we are fighting to dismantle and abolish the police. So tonight we're going to look at a case study of the North Brooklyn Pipeline as a way to look at what connects upstate and downstate issues, economic issues, racial justice issues, and learn what the dangers are and how we can fight against it. So we're going to start with Lee Zishi. Lee is a writer, a documentary filmmaker, and organizer who has worked with hundreds of communities on the front lines of the fight to stop fracking and fracked gas infrastructure. For over 3.5 years, she traveled around the world to these communities as the grassroots coordinator for award-winning documentary films and is directing her first full-length documentary, Thunderdome, USA, about the 2016 presidential election. She has a bachelor's in telecommunications from the University of Florida School of Journalism with a minor in international development and humanitarian assistance. Lee.
Hey. Thanks everybody for being here. It's so nice to see so many faces from across the state and have the chance to kind of be in a panel with these great speakers. So I'm going to just kind of very quickly do a little 101 about the North Brooklyn Pipeline and kind of touch a little bit on how all these issues that you're going to hear a lot more from our amazing speakers kind of all fit into this pipeline. So I'm just going to kind of give you the outline and overview. All right. Yeah, so we are looking at the North Brooklyn Pipeline as a case study. Cool. So what is this Metropolitan Reliability Infrastructure, MRI, North Brooklyn Pipeline? As you can see on the left there, that is a full map of the pipeline, phases 1 through 5 from Brownsville to Greenpoint. And if you're totally like, I have no idea what Brooklyn geography is like, it's kind of all in this like northwest beginning, some of the south part of Brooklyn. Go to the next slide. Right, so the MRI pipeline is a transmission pipeline that would be bringing frack gas through National Grid's system. They told some people when they asked what's going on that this was a replacement of an old pipeline. Construction workers said that, but this is a brand new pipeline. It didn't exist until a couple of years ago. And what National Grid is looking to do is to raise our bills to pay for that. And Jessica is going to talk a lot more about that. And they're hoping to complete their current phase of construction by fall of 2020, and then move into Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And this pipeline leads to a big facility on Newtown Creek where National Grid is looking to expand liquefied natural gas infrastructure they already have there, as well as potentially add a compressor station, compressed natural gas storage, not a compressor station, compressed gas storage. And so this is what some of that, the Greenpoint vaporization, is somebody, I'm hearing an echo. Okay. So this is the Greenpoint facility that they're looking to add new vaporizers to and extend the life of some of the other infrastructure that's been there for a long time. And they also want to add trucking, which is incredibly dangerous to be trucking in and out gas from this facility. Go to the next slide. So the idea of this pipeline, this blue line that you're seeing, is the main transmission system for National Grid. And they're hoping to connect 2 points that weren't previously connected in their system. So down in Brownsville to Greenpoint. They've already raised bills before to pay for this. And Jessica's going to go, like I said, a little bit more into that system. But the first phases cost $188 million. And now National Grid wants to spend an additional $185 million, which comes all out of our pockets to finish this pipeline.
Maybe the moderator can mute everyone.
All right. I think everyone. Okay. So this phase 4 is currently under construction. That's right in Bushwick and beginning to be on the edge of East Williamsburg. No funding has ever been approved for phase 5, yet National Grid has started to do some construction in that area. And so why do we oppose this? One, because we know where this gas is coming from. It's coming from Pennsylvania, where a lot of Sane Energy members are from. I'm from Pittsburgh, so people I love are being fracked to death. And we know that that's really bad for the climate. So you're gonna hear from Bob Haworth about how bad that is. Next slide. We also know that on the other end of this pipeline, the fracking process is really harming people. It pretty much is attacking every system we have in our bodies. The industry tries to say it's clean, but it's not. So how have we been kind of interacting with this pipeline? We've been interacting with something that's called a rate case. And it's not a very accessible process, even though it affects everybody who pays a National Grid bill. Right now, National Grid recently restarted confidential settlement negotiations. So this is a decision that is going to be impacting, millions actually of National Grid ratepayers. And this whole community who has never consented to this pipeline, yet decisions are being made behind closed doors, mostly by white men, lawyers in suits, who aren't there to represent the community. And so in that rate case process, we've been making a couple main arguments. Sane Energy has been arguing that this pipeline goes against climate law for a couple reasons. I'm going to get into that, and that also ratepayers shouldn't be shouldering the bill of this. And the people that decide that decision are something called the Public Service Commission. They are 5 people appointed by Governor Cuomo. And I think Jessica will probably get a lot more into that. But we know here in New York that anything that really happens, Governor Cuomo is the decision maker behind the scenes. So like I said, this is such an important decision for so many people, yet really it's kind of up to Governor Cuomo what happens at the end of the day. And so like I said, we've been making these arguments within the rate case about how this particular pipeline goes against something called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And one of the, that act was fought for very hard by environmental justice communities, frontline communities, and they fought very hard to make sure environmental justice protections were in the CLCPA. And as you'll hear from Jen, this entire pipeline goes through Black and brown communities pretty much until it gets to Greenpoint. And all these communities, including Greenpoint, all along the pipeline route have suffered for decades from different environmental injustices. And National Grid has completely ignored all that. And so we've been arguing within this rate case that just from that extent, just because of that alone, this pipeline goes against the law. It's also really been impacting local businesses. Construction has been terrible for businesses even before COVID, and then they were hit with this terrible pandemic. And, so this, like the La Marqueta, is as a local hub kind of in Bushwick, and they were very much impacted. The other argument we've made that you'll hear much more from Jessica about is that this is not a good investment of ratepayer money. So that's another argument we've been making within the rate case. Go to the next slide. And then, of course, that it goes against our climate laws, which are to reduce emissions. And you'll hear all from Bob about how we cannot reduce emissions if we expand gas. Next slide. So, you know, we're really at a crossroads here. You know, we know, I think we've also been seeing this a lot in the movement to defund police about, like, where is our money going? You know, we don't want our money to continue to go to more frack gas. So the community here in North Brooklyn and all along this pipeline route is standing up because we know, you know, this is the climate fight literally happening right now in our streets. And so that's why we're here tonight to look at it. National Grid isn't just pushing for expansion in North Brooklyn. They're hoping to expand compressor stations along the Iroquois pipeline, putting that in quotes because it's so racist to name a pipeline after Indigenous people. So they're trying to bring more gas from upstate, as well as expand all this infrastructure that they have in Brooklyn. And as you can see, the bigger picture, you know, right now, a lot of our communities are connected with this terrible web of fracking infrastructure. If you look at the You Are Here map, which is an amazing tool that Sane Energy has put together, it shows all of the infrastructure, the frack gas infrastructure in New York, PA, New Jersey, and some into Connecticut and Massachusetts. But you can really see how connected we are, and all the communities along the route that are being hurt for the fossil fuel industry's profits, and then eventually for National Grid's profits. And you'll hear why none of this benefits us from our other speakers. But we're fighting back because we actually have beat pipelines before. We've beaten a lot of them. We just beat a huge pipeline called the Williams Northeast Supply Enhancement, which would have been bringing gas from PA into National Grid system. There has been, you know, wins all over New York. So what we're really trying to set the stage for is, you know, taking back our power by taking back our power. We know that energy is such a huge part of you know, this system that's oppressing us right now. And step by step, we've kind of been beating these pipelines, but we really need a whole statewide moment right now where New York gets off gas for good. And this is just the contact info for me and Kim. After the other speakers, if you have, you know, nitty-gritty questions, happy to answer them, but also, you know, feel free to reach out to Kim and I anytime. We love to nerd out on this stuff.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lee. That was great. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So there you are, Jen. Okay, so we have Jen Chantranapishiye, who is an artist, climate activist, and community organizer from New York City. She serves as the program director at 6th Street Community Center, where she founded their Climate Justice Youth Program. In 2015, she founded CNB, a grassroots community organization that fights environmental racism and for environmental justice as it pertains to waste inequity in North Brooklyn. Welcome, Jen.
So much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation tonight. I'm really honored to be among all of you. So as Monica said, my name is Jen Chantranapishiye, and I use she, her pronouns. I think Monica introduced me very nicely. Thanks so much. I think I want to emphasize that my community organizing experience is really rooted in fighting environmental racism as it pertains to waste and waste inequity. So I'm actually originally from New York City. I'm originally from Queens, but I've been living in North Brooklyn since about 2007. And just from living in the neighborhood, really experienced firsthand a lot of the issues around waste and the high concentration of waste transfer facilities in North Brooklyn. So in about early 2015, I started organizing with families in my neighborhood around these issues that I was witnessing and observing, and just started having conversations with a lot of my neighbors who I had known. You know, there's a lot of families and folks who have kids who, you know, they keep them from playing in the streets because of the high concentration of trucks and things like that. So that's just a little bit of background about me. CNB is a grassroots organization that is supported by this base of local families, neighbors, workers, and businesses. Our focus is really on bottom-up organizing and building community power with those who have been in Bushwick for decades. I also have a background in community-based planning and advocacy, so my passion is really working with people on the ground to develop solutions that they wish to see in their own communities, which is really contrary to traditional top-down city planning. I also just wanted to speak a little bit on kind of this current moment that we're in, and I know, it's been really challenging yet hopeful for a lot of organizers and myself that are really committed to centering racial justice in climate justice work. I think that witnessing the coronavirus pandemic unfold, we really saw how COVID really exposed the inadequacies of our society as a whole. People who might not have been aware to the ills of capitalism were really experiencing failures of capitalism firsthand. Just like really high, unprecedented levels of unemployment, where 44.2 million Americans filed for unemployment during this pandemic, with so many Americans having their health insurance tied to their employment, so many were left uninsured. So I just kind of wanted to, take a moment to reflect on the pandemic, and then also on top of the pandemic, we have found ourselves like seeing how the pandemic is really disproportionately affecting poor people, Indigenous communities, Black communities, and undocumented people. And now we're also in a moment where we're confronting systemic racism that has plagued us for over 4 centuries. I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that our country was founded on stealing land from Indigenous people. They are still stealing from us to this day. And our country was founded on racism, the enslavement and the oppression of Black people. And so while my heart is really heavy by the devastating number of Black people that have been killed by police officers, and we're just seeing more and more in the news every single day, and the systems that still uphold white supremacy, I've also been really motivated to continue the work, and I've been really motivated by the collective energy that I'm just really feeling around us and in the streets. I've seen a lot of you in the streets, so that's been really great. So I'm sorry, I realized that I wasn't really directing the slides, but the slide is a slide of North Brooklyn. This is the North Brooklyn Pipeline, and I think you can go to the next one. Sorry. Okay. So this is a picture of CNB, just to give you a context of some of the folks that I've been organizing with for the past 5 years or so. I think that those of us who work in climate justice know that the climate justice movement is really lacking in centering racial justice. And as Monica said, climate justice needs to include racial justice. We need to be centering Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color who are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis and these environmental issues. And in my opinion, you really can't have climate justice without racial justice. Sorry, if you can go to the next slide. So this, before we go to this slide, to me, this means that work must be led by Indigenous people, Black people, brown people of color. I also have been to a lot of climate justice meetings, organizing meetings over my time where I might be the only person of color there. And, sometimes I haven't even been invited. I would just hear about the meeting and be curious about it and show up. Another dynamic that I want to shout out is climate planning and Policyscape in New York City, and how it really kind of hinges on just a few environmental justice organizations that they really use as what I see as like a rubber stamp for community approval or community input. And I really see that this is reflected in the policies that exist today. because they aren't radical, they aren't inclusive, and they aren't really thinking about Indigenous wisdom or poor communities or communities of color and how they can be part of the work. I think there's a lot more work to be done, especially as we see, you know, coronavirus. It has been impacting our lives, and we can't really be out there meeting people, engaging with people in person the same way we usually do in community organizing. So I think that we need to be really intentional when we go back out there in the streets, in planning, in organizing, in ensuring that folks are being included, folks that have been in these communities for decades. And they really need to be leading the work. Otherwise, it's just, you know, a continuation of white supremacy. So going back to, you know, North Brooklyn, and North Brooklyn being an environmental justice community, it is home to majority Black, brown people of color. It is also primarily low income and working class. So this map is just a map showing the population of color as a percentage on the left with the purple. The dark purple are the communities that are more densely populated with people of color. And then the map on the right is a map of the city that shows the median household income in dollars per census tract. So we see where low income households are clustered. And I think this visual is really stunning. It's more related to waste and waste inequity, and it's one that I use a lot when talking about waste, because we see these red dots and these clusters, and how that's where all the land-based waste transfer stations are located. And as you see with that big arrow, they're all in North Brooklyn, South Bronx, and Southeast Queens, which are all low-income communities of color. So zooming out a little bit more to not waste, but just North Brooklyn as an EJ neighborhood, the neighborhoods that we are focusing on with this pipeline are Brownsville, Bushwick, Williamsburg, and the Greenpoint area near Newtown Creek. In Brownsville, 76% of the population is Black and 20% Latino. I'm sorry, Monica, you can go to the next slide. My slides don't really relate to what I'm talking about, by the way. That they're just kind of visual, so I hope that's all right with everyone. 37% of Brownsville residents live below the federal poverty level, and it is the poorest neighborhood in Brooklyn and the 7th poorest neighborhood in New York City. Prior to the pandemic, just to give you a bit of context, 56% of the population were rent burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income on rent. So if you can imagine, with the majority of New Yorkers living paycheck to paycheck, Brownsville residents also living paycheck to paycheck, being hit with the coronavirus pandemic, losing your job unexpectedly being unable to pay for rent, being able to, you know, pay for healthcare or even food, and then on top of that, dealing with, you know, the failures of capitalism and the climate crisis, and then having an incoming company like National Grid trying to build a pipeline through your community that you didn't consent to, that you had no idea was coming, and that will really impact your life as well as the life of your family's generations to come. So Bushwick, similarly, is 65% Latino, 20% Black, 30% of Bushwick residents live below the federal poverty level, and the unemployment rate is the 2nd highest in Brooklyn. Williamsburg, you know, has suffered from massive waves of gentrification, and therefore lots of the Latino population that has resided there for decades have been displaced, but currently today 27% of that community is Latino. I'm not exactly sure what the next slide is, but maybe you can go to it. Okay, so I'm jumping around a little bit, and I apologize. I hope that you all are keeping up with me. How am I doing on time, Monica? Okay.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Oh, wow. Okay, so I mean, North Brooklyn is an environmental justice community. My background, as I mentioned, is really rooted in organizing with families in fighting environmental racism around waste and waste inequity. You know, Staten Island used to be home to the largest landfill in America. And in the 1990s, when the city closed it down, they needed a place to put down all their waste. So they, what they did instead was they built a bunch of land-based waste transfer stations, which I mentioned they placed in North Brooklyn, South Bronx, Southeast Queens. So North Brooklyn has 19 waste transfer stations out of 40 total citywide, and we're overburdened with handling 40% of New York City's waste. As you can imagine, handling thousands of tons of waste daily for a city of nearly 9 million people can come with just a slew of negative public health and safety issues stemming from truck pollution, high volume of truck traffic, air pollution, toxicity from garbage emissions. That in turn leads to, you know, really deep issues with health issues due to air quality issues stemming from pollution. So in both Brownsville and Bushwick, we have exceedingly high levels of PM 2.5, which is particulate matter. This is like a tiny little particulate matter that gets embedded in your lungs and causes asthma and other really negative respiratory issues. North Brooklyn has an average of 5 times higher air pollutants that cause asthma, and the hospitalization rate among children ages 5 to 14 in Brownsville is almost twice the Brooklyn and citywide rates. And in terms of PM 2.5, they also, as you can imagine, due to all of this truck traffics and the waste transfer stations, they have increased levels compared to the rest of the city and citywide. So North Brooklyn also has other environmental injustices. They have a legacy of contamination, particularly around Newtown Creek, which is a Superfund site. On this slide here, we see the toxic sites mapped in the northeastern corner of Brooklyn, sites that are polluted and remediated. And we also see how that overlaps with the 100-year floodplain, which is on the left. And this is an area that really saw a lot of flooding during Superstorm Sandy. And yeah, I just think that National Grid, to comment on the pipeline, you know, I only got involved, so that is Newtown Creek that I was just mentioning, that photo. But National Grid is a British-owned company, and they have just settled themselves into North Brooklyn without consent. This is a photo of construction of the pipeline that is right in front of my laundromat and a diner that I go to, and these are mom and pop shops. I've talked to all of these business owners. They didn't know that this pipeline was coming. They didn't know what the construction was. They weren't advised by National Grid.
How come I can't hear her?
And yeah, their business has been really impacted by the construction of this pipeline. I know the diner has suffered a huge, massive loss of customers prior to pandemic. I think that we need to call out National Grid for being this capitalist energy lord that it is grossly profiting off of harming our people and our planet. And I think it's no coincidence that they also have been intentionally targeting poor Black and Brown communities like the ones that comprise North Brooklyn in order to expand their energy empires and their profits. So I don't know if I'm out of time, but I feel like I may be. Thanks so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jen. I'm gonna mute again because I heard a wonderful little child's voice there pop up who started to moderate. So thanks again, Jen. We're going to move on to Bob Haworth. Bob is a professor at Cornell University, an earth systems scientist, and a leading world expert on methane emissions from shale gas as a driver of climate change. He has published widely, testified before the US Senate and Congress, as well as the European Union Parliament, and given briefings at the White House. I think you've heard of that, right? Currently, he serves as a member of New York State's Climate Action Council, the group charged with implementing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, otherwise known as the CLCPA. Thanks, Bob, for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's very pleased to be with you. Can you go to the first slide, please? I'm going to run through a little bit of the science on methane and climate change, and then get into the CLCPA and what we might be able to do there. So just to remind you, methane's a greenhouse gas. It's over 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and natural gas is methane. So when we're talking about methane as a greenhouse gas, think natural gas. Next slide, please. And my context for thinking about this is the United Nations agreement from Paris back in 2015, where all of the nations of the world came together and said, you know, we really need to keep the planet well below 2 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial baseline. Scientific community says 1.5 degree is dangerous. And the reason that's dangerous is that we run the risk of runaway global warming, tipping points in the climate system when we approach that. We've already warmed the planet by about 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius. So this is not some far off target. And the critical thing is that if we're to meet this target, we have got to reduce methane emissions. We cannot do it simply by looking at carbon dioxide. Next slide. And this is a classic paper. It's now 8 years old, but it's held up quite well. And you're looking at the warming of the planet over the 20th century up to about 2011, that jagged line. And then you're looking at 4 projections of what the planet could be in the future, going back from 2012 into the future. That top line, green one, where it says no greenhouse gas reductions, that is what would happen if we don't reduce either methane or carbon dioxide. And we're going to blow through 1.5 degrees in just 10 years from now and keep warming. The next line down from that is, can you go back one? Thank you. If we reduce carbon dioxide, and there's a lag of about 25 or 30 years, the planet continues to warm at the same rate. The Earth just doesn't respond quickly to changes in carbon dioxide, so we'll blow right through those targets again. The bottom 2 lines are what happens if we reduce methane, and maybe methane plus carbon dioxide. So we need to reduce methane if we're going to meet these important targets and reduce the risk of runaway global warming. Next slide. So I've been working on this as a issue for about 10 years, and Tony and Graffi and I and others published the first ever paper looking at the role of methane in shale gas as what the greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas might be. We published that 9 years ago now, and I won't go through this in any detail other than to just tell you that, again, natural gas, including shale gas, is methane. Since methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas, small emissions of unburned methane matter. And in our original study, we used the best available data, and we said, you know, methane's probably emitted enough from shale gas and from conventional natural gas that when you throw in methane as well as carbon dioxide, it actually has a greenhouse gas footprint worse than coal. So it's not a bridge fuel at all. Next slide. That was our tentative conclusion going back again 9 years ago. But the data behind that were really poor, and we admitted that. And we called for our colleagues to get out there and make measurements, which people have done. And as of last week, there are now over 1,400 papers. Again, ours was the first 9 years ago. So it's a huge blossoming of science on it. And I'm obviously not going to go through all of that at the moment. But if we go to the next slide, I'll give you the take-home message as of the moment. So here I'm looking at the greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas, diesel oil, and coal, and that yellowish color is the CO2 that's emitted when you burn the fuel, and the red is the unburned methane emissions. And there's a little bit associated with oil and coal, but there's a lot more emissions associated with natural gas because, again, natural gas is methane. This is the best available data at the moment, these 1,400 papers. I'm being conservative here. Probably natural gas is a little bit worse than this looks, but clearly natural gas is a climate disaster. So next slide. The other way it's a climate disaster is that methane has been rising rapidly in the atmosphere over the last decade. This shows you from 1980 up until 2015. And for a while, it looked like methane emissions were slowing down, but since 2008, globally, they've taken off. And a lot of us have been putting a lot of time into trying to figure out what's going on there. And I published a paper last summer on it, and I have another paper coming out soon on it. I'm 100% convinced that fossil fuels are the major driver of this, mostly natural gas. And then shale gas in North America is causing at least 35% of this, maybe 50% of the total global increase in methane from all sources. So shale gas is a climate disaster. Next slide. Now, of course, New York banned fracking of shale gas back in 2015 within our border, and that's great. But all of the natural gas in New York is now shale gas, mostly from Pennsylvania. And our use of natural gas is growing rapidly in this state. It's growing more rapidly than any other state in the country, and against all shale gas with a big climate impact. So that's the wrong direction to be going. Next slide. And I personally don't think we should have natural gas as any part of our energy future. We should get rid of it as quickly as we can. But what can we do instead? Next slide. I'm very proud to say that I worked with Mark Jacobson, a brilliant engineer at Stanford, and he and I and others published this paper 7 years ago, which was the first ever specific plan for any state as to how we might get rid of fossil fuels and have a fossil fuel-free future. And this, in many ways, laid the intellectual framework for the Green New Deal and also for the CLCPA. Next slide. This is what the plan called for, and we're behind schedule because it's CLCPA only came into force in January. But this is the plan. Instead of having that projected demand of energy going up into the future over the time, we can get rid of fossil fuels and use heat pumps for heating and electrify transportation. And that alone, because those things are so efficient, reduces energy use. Other efficiencies you can have, better insulation, et cetera, further reduces the amount of energy we need to live as well as we already do. And then you can wean out fossil fuels and bring in solar and wind to make it up. So that's the plan. We said originally if we'd started on this 7 years ago that we could be largely fossil fuel free by 2035, 2040. We're behind schedule, but that's still the goal. Next slide. And then I just want to say it is possible. That's my home, and I'm speaking to you from today. There's not snow on the ground here today, luckily, but there was a month ago. Our house, it's an 1890s house. It's completely carbon neutral. My driving for 8 years has been by electric car. These are technologies that are available that truly are cost effective, and we need to get more and more of this technology across the state. Next slide. So that takes us to the CLCPA, which was passed by the Assembly and Senate a year ago, but was signed by the governor only at Christmas time, and so only became law in January. And I just want to very briefly tell you some of the goals, the mandates which are in it. One is that it specifically says we need to account for greenhouse gas methane differently than we have in the past. And I'll show you a little bit of data on that. But in the past, most of the methane that's emitted from our use of shale gas happens in Pennsylvania. In the past, we didn't take possession of that. But this law says if we're burning gas that's coming from the fracked fields of Pennsylvania and causing methane emissions there, we need to take possession and ownership of that and include it in our planning. It calls for reducing greenhouse gas emissions overall from all sources by 40% in 10 years from now. 70% of our electricity has to come from renewables within 10 years. And then we have these by 2040, 100% emissions-free electricity, and by 2050, largely free of all emissions. There's a 22-person climate action council that's supposed to develop the policies to actually implement this. I'm very proud to tell you I'm one of the members of that. I was appointed by the Democratic majority in the Assembly. That's the good news. The bad news is we've had only one meeting ever. We're having our second meeting ever next week, and hopefully we'll start making some progress because so far, quite frankly, we have not. Next slide. I just want to give you my sense of what I think the state should be doing, what I think we should be doing on the Climate Action Council. So I, with other members, are pushing for absolutely no new fossil gas infrastructure, no new pipelines. It just makes no sense if we're to meet these targets of going 40% reduction in emissions in 10 years. I don't think we should allow any natural gas in any new home or business construction. We should get rid of the subsidies that are tied behind that and move again to high efficiency heat pumps. So electrify heating, electrify transportation. We need to move much more aggressively on solar and wind. We need to have a trained workforce to make this happen. And the CLCPA talks a lot about environmental justice. Certainly siting should be part of that, but the workforce should all be part of it. There's an incredible number of high quality jobs that are needed for this. I also think we should institute a carbon fee, a tax on both carbon dioxide and on methane. And the next slide will tell you why I'm emphasizing methane. This is work of Drew Schindel, social cost of carbon. So this is the damage to the environment, to the climate, but also to public health from carbon dioxide and from methane. And he calculates that carbon dioxide is doing $84 of damage per ton, but that methane is doing $4,600 damage per ton. And a lot of that's because of the public health issues associated with these methane emissions. So it isn't just about climate, and we really need to move forward on that. Next slide. And I just want to point out that if we look at the increase in methane flux globally, not the total flux even, but the increase in methane flux that's due to the oil and gas industry globally over the last decade, and we apply this social cost of methane, that's almost $1 trillion in damage that industry's been done. And we really need to be capturing those funds and shutting that industry down. Next slide. So just a couple more slides here to make one more point. A little bit of data for those of you who are interested in. This is the greenhouse gas inventory as of a few years ago in the way that New York State has traditionally done it and continues to do it. So you're looking at sectors, transportation sector there, electric sector, and red colors are from natural gas. Dark red is carbon dioxide from natural gas, and the lighter red is methane emissions from natural gas, and you don't see it because it barely shows up in the traditional accounting. Blue is the same for petroleum, and black is coal, which really isn't a big player in our state. Next slide. So under the CLCPA, fundamentally, we're changing the rules here because we're taking possession of the methane that's emitted in Pennsylvania for our natural gas. And here you see those much larger bars for natural gas from the residential sectors, home heating, and also from electricity. A large part of the greenhouse gas footprint is from methane. And again, we need to be shutting that down. Next slide. If we look at what the emissions are using this new way of calculating things, then we're supposed to reduce by 40% within 10 years compared to the 1990 emissions. We've made almost no progress since 1990. Carbon dioxide emissions have gone down as we got rid of coal, but methane emissions have gone up as we've used more natural gas. So we have a big target to meet here, and we're not going to meet it just by concentrating on electricity. We really need to get natural gas out of residential and commercial, and we also need to get petroleum out of transportation. So next slide.
Bob, you've got 2 minutes.
This is my last slide, so I'm actually done.
Perfect.
And again, to me, starting with the United Nations proclamation, the COP21 meeting in Paris, if we are to meet this climate goal and stop the risk of irreversible climate change, we need to move very aggressively away from all fossil fuels, particularly shale gas, not just coal. The CLCPA is the most ambitious climate legislation in the country, perhaps the world, but we need to actually implement it, and we need community activists to help push for its activation if it's really going to happen. So I'm really very pleased to be talking with you tonight and being included in this group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thanks everyone still for being with us. I know that some folks said that friends were trying to get on. We have a max at 100, but it's live streaming several places, and I put that in the chat too. So if you want to send that to your friends, they can join us in that way. Okay, Our next speaker is Jessica Ajoulay, is the Executive Director of Alliance for a Green Economy, a Syracuse-based nonprofit working to advance a just transition to a 100% renewable energy system in all sectors. Jessica is a policy analyst, researcher, and activist who puts her skills in the hands of the people all over New York fighting to eliminate dirty energy in all forms. Hi, Jessica. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on this amazing panel of speakers and to talk to you all about the future of heating and cooking in New York with this case study on the North Brooklyn Pipeline. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, what the heck is National Grid and how are they making their money off this pipeline and all of that. So you can just go right to my first slide there. So just to ground us in what we're talking about here and where the North Brooklyn Pipeline sits on, you know, within a system that starts with the extraction of methane gas or fracked gas, or quote unquote natural gas as the industry likes to call it, largely in Pennsylvania, and then gets transferred to New York through these large interstate pipelines. And once it gets into New York and gets to National Grid's territory, it's called a distribution system. And the utilities that distribute gas to our houses and around their territory are called distribution utilities. And National Grid is a distribution utility. One of their arms is in downstate New York. I actually have National Grid as my utility upstate as well in Syracuse. And then they get it to your home and you pay your bill to them. And so you can go to the next slide. And I just want to talk about what it means when we say National Grid is a utility. And actually, they're a regulated investor-owned gas utility. And I just want to break down what that means. So in New York, most of the utilities that deliver gas and electricity to our homes are regulated investor-owned utilities. And a utility is generally a monopoly entity that delivers a service through a shared infrastructure. And they're a monopoly because you wouldn't necessarily want multiple companies or entities competing to deliver gas or electricity to our houses and building multiple versions of pipelines and multiple transmission lines or distribution electric lines to our system. So there's kind of been an agreement that one entity should do that. And in some cases, it's not a private company. In some cases, it could be a municipality. But in New York, most of it is for-profit companies. And in the case of a gas utility, their job is to distribute methane gas, also known as fracked gas, since most of the gas in New York comes from fracking. And what it means when we say they're investor-owned, it means they're a corporation that's really accountable to its investors. And its purpose is to make profit for its investors. And that's really what drives the company in terms of why it makes the decisions that it makes and why it pushes the types of investments that it pushes. It's really trying to make profit for its investors and get as much of our money as the customers away from us and into the investors' pockets. And the only check on how much they can do that is regulation and protest. So in the case of the investor-owned utilities in New York, they're regulated by the Public Service Commission, which is a state entity. It's a 5-member board appointed by Governor Cuomo. And they regulate how much the utility can charge us and for what, and what they can spend that money on. So that's what we mean when we talk about a regulated investor-owned gas utility. So you can go to the next slide. So what's in it for National Grid to be building this North Brooklyn pipeline in an era when so many people have stood up to say, you know, no to fossil fuels. We have climate goals that require us to be reducing fossil fuels, and particularly, as Bob just noted, requiring us to reduce fracked gas and reduce methane. So why are they pushing this? And they're pushing it because National Grid's investors make their money really by lending money and getting paid back with interest. This is kind of core to capitalism, right? You can make money by having money and by lending it and getting paid back with interest. So they make their money when they can invest it in big, expensive projects, and then they get paid back with interest by ratepayers. And ratepayers is their term for customers. And they're called ratepayers because we pay rates to the company. And in order to justify those investments and make that money, National Grid has to convince the regulators that the infrastructure it wants to build is needed. That's really like the check on them. You know, they have to prove and show that they really do need to build all this infrastructure that they can then make a bunch of money on. And the way they show that is by showing that there is an increased demand for what they're selling, so an increase in demand for gas, or they show that, you know, a big pipeline or project needs to be replaced or repaired, or it's needed, they need to build kind of some redundancy into the system to build resilience into the system and improve reliability. And so those are the justifications usually that you might hear from a company like National Grid, is they're trying to prove to the regulators and to the people that they need to build this pipeline so that they can invest their investors' money and make profit off of it by getting interest payments from the ratepayers. You can go to the next slide. So what's in it for you? And I might call this my sarcastic slide. What's in it for the ratepayers? You know, what's in it for National Grid is they get to make money by lending money and building these pipelines. What's in it for the ratepayers, this is the only thing that is in it for us, is that utilities can provide reliable and, I think really importantly, universal service. So the idea is that everyone in their territory gets served. Now, that's not necessarily always the case, because we also, you know, many people experience utility shutoffs. And, you know, if they can't pay their bill, if they can't afford their bill. So we don't actually have reliable universal service in New York. And as we saw with National Grid, with their moratorium, and their denials of service, they were not providing universal service. But theoretically, the idea of the utility is that they serve everyone, and the costs of serving everyone are shared across all of the customers in the territory. They say that what's in it for us is also more access to gas in National Grid territory. That used to be considered a good thing. And you'll still hear the company and the regulators sometimes and many talk about, you know, increasing access to gas as a good thing because, you know, gas is artificially cheap and they think it's good for economic development, et cetera. So that's you know, but we don't think that that's a good thing anymore. We need to be moving away from gas. Another thing that happens here is higher rates. When they can build more pipelines and charge the ratepayers for that and charge the ratepayers for the interest on it, they can charge higher rates. So that's not really a good thing for us, but it's good for the utility. And it also forces us, when we're faced with these situations, to join with our neighbors and in our community to fight. And, you know, I'm trying to come up with some silver lining here on the slide of what's in it for us. But I do think that joining with our neighbors and with our communities to say our vision for the world can sometimes be a good thing. So you can go to the next slide. And so, you know, what this has really set up is, as I've shown, sort of the interests of the utility and the interests of the customers are not really the same, right? They want to build as much infrastructure as they can, even in the era of the climate law that says we need to be transitioning off of gas. And it really sets up sort of a conflict between the interests of National Grid and the interests of the people of New York. And so we have told them so many times, and you have told them so many times, that we're ready to transition off of fossil fuels, and yet they still, because they're trying to maximize profits for their investors, and the only way they can see to do that is by building more pipelines, they still keep trying. And they really don't know what else to do. And so I think in this moment, what we're seeing is gas utilities try to take advantage of this moment before we've got the really strict regulations in place that I hope we're going to see from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And Bob, we're counting on you to try to make this happen. You know, I think eventually it's going to be very clear, and we're going to have really clear regulation that says we cannot keep building gas infrastructure if we're going to meet our climate goals. But because that hasn't been 100% spelled out in every single way from, you know, the top on down to the utilities, they're just trying to get as much fossil fuel infrastructure in the ground as they can, so that we will have to keep paying for it for decades to come, and they will keep making money off the money that they have. And they're kind of protected in doing this to some degree, because even if the infrastructure that they put in today, even if we phase it out soon, like in the next decade or two, they're counting on the regulators to still make us pay for those pipelines, even if they're not useful. And there's some differences of opinion about that and how strongly they'll be able to make that happen, but they feel pretty protected that if the regulators tell them, yes, this pipeline is needed, they feel pretty strongly that we'll just keep paying for it, even if we phase those pipelines out later. But that's not good for us, obviously. So go ahead, you can go to the next slide. So, so there are alternatives, and I think that this is, you know, really important for all of us to keep in mind and to fight for. So the alternative to building more pipelines in the face of growing demand for heating and cooking, to the degree that there is growing demand through new construction and to the degree that people want to be getting off of fuel oil, et cetera, there are alternatives. We do not need fossil fuels to heat our homes or to cook. And so the alternatives are to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we need through efficiency, through weatherization, insulation, to really reduce how much fossil fuels are needed to heat. We can also heat with something called a heat pump. And heat pumps are really cool. They're kind of like magic. They use renewable energy from the air or the ground. There's renewable thermal energy all around us in the air and the ground, even in the winter. And they use a relatively small amount of electricity to convert that energy into heating or cooling. So they can be used for air conditioning as well. So there's air source heat pumps, which use renewable energy from the air. And there's ground source heat pumps, also called geothermal heat pumps, that use thermal energy from the ground. And the geothermal heat pumps are very efficient. So they really reduce the amount of energy needed to heat. And they can be run, both kinds of heat pumps can be run on electricity, which means we can power them with renewable energy. So it's a way to get to 100% renewable heating.
Jessica, you
and
have
then,
a minute and a half. So.
Okay, and then for cooking, we can use induction cooktops, which are also a very efficient way to cook with electricity that are just as responsive as a gas stove. You can go to the next slide. So how do we transition cost effectively? I put this in two buckets. We need to stop expanding gas, so we need to stop all these infrastructure projects that are about meeting new demand or about redundancy or resiliency. And Bob mentioned this. We need to not allow gas in new construction. It's cost effective to put heat pumps right into new construction. It's cheaper than fossil fuel systems right off the bat, so we should just be doing that. And for oil to gas conversions, customers can already save a lot of money by going to a geothermal system compared to oil. So we should be doing that too. We should not be transitioning from oil to gas. We should go straight from oil to heat pumps. And then for people that are currently using gas, this is where we have to start dismantling the gas system. And that's going to be a little bit more complicated. But the way I see this is we have to get early adopters to do it, those who can afford it, while we figure out how to build that universal service through shared heating systems and manage the decapitalization of the gas system, manage the dismantling of the gas system so that we don't leave people behind, so we don't just have people with means switching off the gas system and leaving everybody else with the stranded assets. We really need to think about this and strategize about it together. The next slide, which is my final slide, I just want to say that we're going to figure this out together. There are people all over New York who are fighting for renewable heating, and we're really thinking about how to dismantle the gas system in a comprehensive and orderly way. And we're pushing to stop gas expansion and gas in new construction. We're doing it through a coalition called Renewable Heat Now. And we're going to be right there along with you along the way as we fight these pipelines and figure out how to get ourselves off gas for heating. And I will end there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jessica. And for our final speaker, I'm so excited. Thanks everyone for hanging around. We're going to take questions after that. I saw someone raised a hand and there have already been some questions. And a lot of people are answering questions, so that's great. So our final speaker, Olafemi Tylo, is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, where he teaches social political philosophy rooted in the Black radical tradition and anti-colonial thought. His public philosophy includes articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, and he is currently writing a book entitled Reconsidering Reparations that considers a novel philosophical argument for reparations and explores links with environmental justice. Welcome, Femi.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? Yeah? Okay. So, thanks for that introduction. As was said, the stuff that I'm working on is on the ties between racial justice and climate justice. And to spoil the book, the argument that I'm making is that in the foreseeable future, they are in an identical project. They're the same project. And, you know, people are often a little freaked out by that suggestion, a little confused by that suggestion. So what I want to talk about today is why I think that's true. And a number of the people who have spoken today have, you know, in various ways affirmed that racial justice and climate justice are tied together, and that the environmental justice movement, even more broadly than the climate justice movement, needs to take into account environmental racism and center the voices of frontline communities, which are disproportionately Black, Brown, and Indigenous. And all that's true, but there are different ways that you could think about why that's true. And so I want to just talk about how I understand the relationship between these things. And a thing I've been talking about a lot recently today is the climate struggle, the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, and the police violence crisis as one singular crisis. And, you know, two of those seem different from the third. So COVID and climate seem to be provoked by natural phenomena. What's going on with viruses, what's going on with the air and the water. But I think those crises are every bit as politically constructed, every bit as political from top to bottom as the crisis of police violence. And to see why, we can take a little bit of a detour and talk about how famines are studied and what we can learn from famines. And, you know, I'm a philosopher, you know, all I can do is philosophy. I apologize for starting off in a very heady place. Everyone else was much more grounded, but I promise we'll get there. We'll get to a very grounded, hopefully concrete, you know, set of lessons or set of ways forward from this. But starting with famines, there are basically two ways that you can explain famines happening. Famines are what happen when a bunch of people don't have food to eat. And the natural way to explain that is what's called the food availability approach. So if you see a large famine, if you see a lot of people starve to death in a population, you think something must have gone wrong with the food supply. Maybe there was a drought, maybe there was a pest infestation in the agriculture, maybe there was temperature variations, and so on and so forth. And throughout the history of economics and sociology and other studies of population dynamics, that's the kind of explanation that people usually gravitated towards. But Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen, who was an adept student of colonial history, went back through the data and found that's actually not the predominant explanation for why famines happen. So by one estimate, somewhere around 100 million people died in the many famines that took place from 1870 to around 1970, to 2010 rather. Those 140 years. And in many of these, food availability was not the issue. Food availability either did not decline at all or declined too shallowly to explain why so many people starved to death. So what did go wrong? Amartya Sen gives us two examples from colonial history, one in Bengal in India, where he's from, and one in Ireland. And in both of these cases, people starved to death despite an abundance of food. The Irish colonized subjects of the British Empire were paid wages that were tied to the sale of potatoes, right? So potato revenues helped drive wages for Irish workers. There was a blight, right? So the kind of thing, food availability people think of, right? There was something went wrong with the potato crop, it failed, wages declined. But there was other food, there was corn, right? There were, other crops that did just fine. And so the Irish people who were starving to death were starving in front of stocked shelves that were guarded by police. So Amartya Sen learns from Bengal and learns from Ireland and learns from the fact that people in history have often died en masse in this way in front of abundance of foods, and decided or concluded on the basis of that study, that's not the reason why people die from famines. It might start off ecological, right? Something happened to the potato plant. That's a real thing that happened in the natural world. But what explains what happens as a result of that spark is whether or not the social system, the political system acts to put out the fire. And in Bengal and in Ireland, the legal structure did respond, and it responded to station police in front of stores to protect the food supply and the profits of the people who made money off of the food supply. It acted to protect those profits from the people dying of hunger rather than to protect hungry people dying from starvation. The lesson from this is that ecological phenomena, what's going on with the fires and the locusts and the wind and the rain, these things provoke crisis, but the decisive part of what happens is political. It's the balance of power between elites and the more vulnerable people in a society. Ireland's economy was controlled by British Parliament. They were colonized subjects, same way that the people of Bengal were colonized by the British Empire. The British Empire did not care what happened to them. That's why they died. What's happening now in the COVID crisis is a version of this. People's access to claim rights, people's access to the distributive system, people's access to what the economy produces is mediated through jobs, and people are unemployed. The informal economies, especially in the global south, are contracting as there's less dollars circulating, right? And the lesson that we learned from famine isn't just conceptually instructive for the COVID crisis, but it's a statement of the actual states of the COVID crisis. So even before the pandemic broke out, the United Nations World Food Program warned that 135 million people faced crisis level of hunger or worse. And after the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, that number doubled to around 270. If you add in the 800 or so other million people who live in chronic hunger, you have what they are calling a crisis of biblical proportions on the way. What's going to decide whether people live or die in the COVID crisis, which is compounding with the climate crisis, right? As the COVID economy contracts, there's still going to be wildfires, there's still going to be hurricanes, and the results of these ecological phenomena are going to light sparks that our political system has to respond to. And the question is going to be, at every point, what is the political system going to protect? Because we have the capacity to protect lots of things. But the question is, what will be protected? And what we're learning from the response of our political system to the ongoing endemic problem of anti-Black racism as institutionalized in the police force, and anti-working class sentiment and drive for social order, is that the system is mobilizing to protect elites and not to protect the people. The call to police that resulted in the death of George Floyd was because he attempted to pay for items from a store with a counterfeit bill, that is, in protection of the economic distribution system from supposedly illegitimate claims, in the same way that the system mobilized armed police to protect its corn from Irish workers who were paid in potatoes. When times get hard, the state is going to act to defend the interests it's chosen to defend. And in the emergency legislation to COVID, which is going to compound with climate crisis, we've already seen the choices that at least this current administration is making, which is that the rich get secret bailouts that are unaccountable. They won't even say who got the money, much less why, or defend their decision to give it to whoever the businesses are that got the money from emergency legislation, as opposed to, say, the people who got paltry $1,200 checks. And the only stimulus package of any consequence that working class people in this country are getting is a stimulus package of tear gas and rubber bullets. So that's the philosophy, that's the theory, that's where I'm starting out. But I think what comes out of looking at the problem in this way is a different way about thinking about ways forward. So what we should be looking for in the realm of solutions, based on this lesson that we learned from Sen, Amartya Sen, is that the basic political problem might start with ecology, might start with what the Earth systems are doing, but it's going to be decided by the power discrepancy between elites and non-elites. That is to say that the very same things that we need to do to solve police violence are the very same things that we need to do to solve climate crisis. And the core part of what we need to do to address both of these is to solve the basic political problem, which is elite capture of our institutions. By elite capture, I just mean the fact that institutions respond to a smaller set of interests than the whole communities. We were just told about this in a very succinct way in the description of who National Grid answers to, and the unelected commission of 5 people that the governor has installed to quote unquote regulate them, right? These people decide whether or not the people of Brownsville can breathe. Until we challenge this basic political structure, I think we're going to have a hard time winning the other things that we want to win. And so the framework for the 2 things that I want to mention to you, and that hopefully we'll get to talk more about in the Q&A, are both things targeted at generating community power, at changing who has decision-making power in the first place over which pipelines get built and which don't, which utilities are constructed and which don't. And the first of these is taken directly from the a response to the police violence crisis, which is being advocated for by Pan-African Community Action, or PACA. So M. Adams of Freedom Inc. and Max Rameau of PACA have been advocating for a plan called Community Control Over Police. And according to that plan, police would be governed, controlled by a pair of civilian boards. So we're not talking about civilian oversight, we're not talking about civilian input, we're talking about direct hiring, firing, and funding, and priority setting, direct power by civilian boards. These boards would be staffed by sortition, which is just a fancy way of saying the same way juries are. You randomly select people from the population. That severs the ties between who's in control of these decisions and the current structure that's dominated by lobbying and backdoor deals and all sorts of stuff of that nature that, you know, half the time we have to speculate about and half the time we don't like what we see, right?
Femi, you have 2 minutes. Sorry.
Thanks. So I'll just wrap up. But whether or not we adopt community control over police and adopt that way of thinking for utilities, that's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about. How do we break the basic political connections between moneyed interests like National Grid and the formal institutions that are the bases of power? And the second and last thing I want to talk about in terms of correcting the basic power imbalance that is the core problem is bargaining for the common good. The normal framework of worker bargaining is the organized workers and the union on one side of the table, and on the other side of the table, the bosses, the corporations. That's not a fair fight. The suggestion of bargaining for the common good, which is being advocated by Forge Organizing and other institutions and has been prototyped by an SEIU, union local, and community organizations in Minnesota, is we gang up on the bosses, right? So it's not just the organized workers, but they're supported by community organizations. So what if Sane Energy Project and, say, public sector workers were in a bargaining for the common good arrangement, much like the Chicago Teachers Union used, and the state was risking a strike if they refused to grant not only concessions to the workers, but to the broader community those workers live in and have families in and are in community relations with. How would that change the calculus? How much stomach would the regulators have? What kind of concessions would we win from that kind of basis? There are undoubtedly plenty of complications to this kind of process. I don't want to sugarcoat anything, but I think this is worth some attention. This is worth some thought, because at the end of the day, we have to decide whether we are going to, whether we think we can win our demands, what we need for a clean future, what we need for a climate just future. If we think we can win that by asking the state to do better, as opposed to putting ourselves in decision-making power and asking each other to do better. I like the second model, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so, so much. What an amazing panel we have, right? Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Kim, and then she's going to show you how we're going to run questions, and then we're going to go right into that. Thanks everyone so much for hanging out with us.
Thank you so much. You are all incredible human beings, and I look forward to building the new world with you. We are going to get right to questions. I'm going to share my screen really quickly again, just to show you how to get on Stack for these questions. We made a little slide in our slideshow. So if you want to get on Stack, go to the bottom middle and hover over where you see participants and click that, and a sidebar will open on the right, and then you'll see a little option to raise your hand. So if you want to get on Stack, so far do that now, and Lee is going to moderate the Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's get started.
All right. It looks like the first person who has a question is Joshua Douglas. Are you still there, Joshua? I think your hand might have been up for a little while.
Yeah, I guess I'm unmuted now, I think, right?
Yeah, we can hear you. What's your question?
So, I think this is an amazing panel. I was actually on the, seat of my pants, really paying attention to everything that everybody said. I think it was really amazing. I've been working with Mike Sussman on opposing Cricket Valley. And about a month ago, there was Bill Maher had Al Gore on, and he was saying that Harvard did a study, and it showed that people living in areas of poor air quality have a much higher chance of dying from COVID than people that live in areas of normal air quality. And so it triggered me to say, what we need to do? We need to do a couple things, and that got turned into what I think is a very important idea, and I'd like to get some responses from your panel and see what people think. And we have a letter that basically calls on a couple things. But one thing that I just wanted, Dr. Haworth had said before, and I really appreciate who he is and what he's done, and he basically said, I think that the CLCPA doesn't, not every single person on the CLCPA is a Bob Haworth, is a Dr. Haworth. And so we need to have a lot of public participation in ensuring that the CLCPA does what the people that are engaged in this phone call wanted to do, which is be serious and really get the job done.
Thank
so
you,
our letter
let's give
says
the
a couple
panelists
things.
an opportunity to answer that. Bob or Femi or Jen or Jessica, because we want to make sure that we can also have other questions. So let's keep our question answering really brief. Thanks.
Let me just briefly, air pollution from fossil fuels is a big factor in increasing risk from COVID. It definitely makes things worse, as does tear gas, by the way, in the streets. And the Climate Action Council has 22 members, 12 are agency heads, and others are appointed. So, in order to be effective, we are going to need to be pushed. I don't think the council, if left to its own devices, is going to be effective at all. So I do hope we'll be pushed.
Amy or Jen, would you like to add anything to that before we go to the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing that COVID is disproportionately affecting people that already have respiratory issues. And in North Brooklyn, I think I mentioned, people are more likely to have asthma and respiratory issues that are related to the air pollution that's already existing and the high volume of truck traffic. It's all related. That's what I would say.
Next up, we have Carol.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you to all the speakers. Amazing. My question is simple as a question, but complicated probably as an answer. And it is, what can we do? Should the rest of this be a brainstorming session? Both small and small actions, big actions, regional actions, statewide actions, and wider actions. Everything from, right now we can't show up at the Climate Action Council with signs. is there a way, I mean, I assume we can tune in and watch them, but they won't necessarily know we're out here unless we figure out a way to maybe have pictures of us with signs flashing across somebody's screen in the background who's entitled to be there. In my own case, I've been a member of a participant in the rate case upstate where I live with NYSEG. But, how do we join forces across the state? I'm a member of Renewable Energy now, but what are the things that we could be doing, other than listening to incredible panelists and learning, what a lot of us already know, which is that this is all connected and we need to be doing more. Both those in power need to know we're here, both informed, writing letters, showing up, but pushing harder, both in the streets and out, and in the whole.
Cheryl. Let's let the panelists answer that. So if folks could just be really concise with their questions, that would be really great. Thanks.
I mean, I would like to see money being placed directly in the hands of people living in frontline communities, so that way they can be building hyper-local, sustainable solutions that confront some of these issues. In New York right now, we're talking about defunding the NYPD, and the NYPD has a budget of $5.6 billion, which is more than the budget of youth, homeless services, housing, and healthcare combined. And when we think about the climate crisis and how we really need to be developing solutions that mitigate the root causes of the climate crisis, some solutions we're thinking about are public power, which I saw Lee dropped in the chat, which is really re-envisioning our energy utility system to be publicly owned, publicly controlled, more democratic, decolonized, and not owned by companies like National Grid. So we really need people to be kind of understanding these issues really deeply and how it connects to capitalism and how it is related to racism and how communities have been systematically disinvested in, and I think prioritizing these communities to make sure that they have the tools and the financial power to develop their own solutions.
Yeah, just to jump off that quickly, if the NYPD were a country, it would have its budget would represent a larger military budget than 17 out of the 29 members of NATO. So I completely agree with what Jen just said on both points. I mean, you have to vastly reallocate where money goes and who has it, and you have to change power relations. So I just want to say community control is necessary. They won't defund themselves, right? And even if they defund themselves this year, if they're still the people who decide next year's budget, we're going to be starting at square one. So we need community control. So public control of utilities sounds great.
I'm also going to just very quickly in the chat drop a way that you can comment in the rate case. We are trying to push from the inside, but really understand this outside game too. As St. Energy, when we went into cross-examine National Grid, within this process, I was wearing like the DSA public power jacket. So I think, we just definitely need to have this conversation and keep pushing them, because right now communities are 100% not represented in this process. So next up we have Joan's iPad with the question. And just remember, since we're kind of at time, really try to keep your question brief. Let's unmute you. You're on mute.
Okay.
Yep.
The issue and questions that I want to bring up was not really addressed. And that is, first, the in situ source of fracking and the damage that it does to the location, whether we use whatever shale, particular type of Marcellus shale or other kind of shales that we use, the various chemicals that go into it that politically they tried to hide because most of these chemicals were toxic, very toxic, and they were carcinogenic. In addition, the effects that could have on the aquifers and on fresh water. So I'm talking about before it even gets into a pipeline. And once it finally does get into a pipeline, very little management of a completed pipeline once it's done, and virtually no, we don't even manage and aware of that at least 5% methane leakages taking place from these pipelines. That's the points I want to make. Who would like to address those issues?
Nobody.
Nobody?
Nobody.
Are they reasonable
really
issues?
unclear what your question was. If we could just could you just repeat the question?
You don't put in your question.
The question is very simple. You know, the fracking itself is itself affects our water supply.
That's not a question.
It does it
Right.
not affect
We
the
all
water
we all agree with you. We're all here coming from a common ground that fracking is bad. What is your exact question? That's what we're trying to get at.
Well, so the question is, is fracking still economical because of the fact that many fracking companies are going out of business because of the coronavirus? That's my
The
question.
economics of fracking.
Yes.
Fracking never made sense economically. It's been a Ponzi scheme since day one, and there are plenty of good analyses of that. Some people have gotten rich off of it, but the companies themselves have never sold the product at a profit. And it's COVID has helped take it down more quickly, but the big fracking companies were in a death knell even before this. So it just doesn't. It's an atrocity in all sorts of ways, including economically.
And I would just say in the rate case, we've brought up, the impacts of fracking in Pennsylvania, and National Grid doesn't care. We've brought up the climate impacts. They do not care. They literally told us that we don't understand methane emissions when we said that they have to look at the emissions from PA. And we asked them, did you look at the communities? Did you look at the environmental history of these communities, the makeup of these communities, which is now required by the CLCPA? And they do not care at all. So we care very deeply about that stuff. National Grid does not give a shit. So we have one final question. It looks like it'll be from Adam Flint.
Sorry, I was a bit slow coming off mute. Yeah, this is a great panel. I have a question, I think, that starts with the last speaker. Part of the exploding Black Lives Matter movement that's in the streets right now is about redirecting resources away from the police and towards social needs. We could bring that up to the level of the Pentagon. Here in New York, we have a $60 billion deficit, and the governor refuses to raise revenue from the rich and from Wall Street. I'm wondering if you or any of the other panelists see some opportunities to bring the efforts together to pass like 14 bills in the legislature to force Cuomo's hand with the movement in the streets. Also understanding that we're hampered in our work on climate when we are facing a proposition where municipalities and school districts will be laying off people by the thousands if we can't start changing our regressive revenue situation.
Yeah, it's a great question because these are all connected. So what I want to say quickly is I think the more sortition that we have, the more direct community control over budgetary processes, the better. I'm not sure if the current movement is articulating the struggle in ways where, talking about budgetary processes is the next immediate logical move. But the map that it has been linked in the chat, the Bargaining for the Common Good map, would show when New York union contracts are expiring. And I think the threat of coordinated strikes around a bargaining for the common good model, where community demands about the budget are part of the worker organizing and are part of the strike threat. I think that's the bit of leverage that we have on that kind of issue.
I think that's all we have time for today. We're 9 minutes over, but pretty good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for being with us today. Thanks to everyone who joined us in the Zoom chat as well as in all the live streams that we had going. We will post it. If you registered for the event, you will be able to get the follow-up and be able to share this video again and watch it to your heart's content. So thanks so much, everyone. Keep fighting and keep learning, and we're going to do it. Okay, take care.